as it relates to politics and society. Ideas of race, gender, class, nationality, and religion aid not only in determining one's personal politics, but in creating a lens through which they see the world. While these identities can shape us as individuals and unite some of us, they can often divide us from others as well. But where do they come from? What are they actually for? How do our conceptions of identity affect the choices that we make as individuals, families, nations, groups of people? Through our conversation today, we hope to take a step in beginning to understand the wide array of and layers of complexities inherent to identities. We have the privilege today of hearing from one of our era's defining thinkers on this very topic. Kwame Anthony Appiah was born in England and raised in Ghana. He studied medicine and philosophy at Cambridge University as an undergraduate and completed a doctoral degree in philosophy there in 1982. Since then, he has taught at Yale, Cornell, Duke, Harvard, and Princeton before coming to our very own NYU to be professor of philosophy and law in 2013. He has written widely in philosophy, especially in ethics and political philosophy, and in African and African American studies. He's lectured on these subjects in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Professor Appiah is the author of Cosmopolitanism, The Honor Code, and The Lies That Bind, and more than a dozen other philosophical works, 3 novels, and hundreds of articles and reviews. He writes the weekly Ethicist column for the New York Times and has received honorary degrees from 50 universities, most recently Occidental College 2012, Harvard University 2012, the University of Pennsylvania in 2013, Edinburgh University in 2013, and Wesleyan University in 2016. He has been president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association, of the Penn American Center, and of the Modern Language Association, and chaired the board of the American Council of Learned Societies. He currently sits on the board of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the New York Public Theater, and the New York Public Library. In 2012, President Obama presented him with the National Humanities Medal. In 2017, he became a member of the Royal Society of Literature. I would invite Professor Appiah to address us, followed by some questions and a chance for an audience to engage with him as well. Without further ado, Kwame Anthony Appiah.
Well, thank you very much, Akash, and thank you to the Review and Debates for inviting me to speak with you this evening. I think what I'm going to do is to sort of discuss for a bit some general ideas about identity. Then I may, depending on how much time is then left, say something about different kinds of identity politics, and then maybe we can open it up for discussion. But let me just start with some more general remarks. So if you ask contemporary people in the North Atlantic world, people here in the United States and Canada or in Europe, to discuss their identities, they'll have plenty to say. They might mention a country, a faith, sexuality, at least if they're not straight, a race, at least if they're not white, and they may avoid saying much about gender at first, not because it isn't central to their identity, but because they'll think that's too obvious to mention, that it is central to their identity. Now, all these are forms of what we call identity, and we all know how to place ourselves on one of these identity grids. So I think it's startling to realize how new this way of talking is. Before the Second World War, so far as I know, nobody used the English word identity or its cognates in other European languages in this way. So that when Erik Erikson spoke of an identity crisis in the life of the young Martin Luther in his 1958 book, Young Man Luther, a study in psychoanalysis and history, he wasn't focusing on a crisis in Luther's relation to the social groups he belonged to. But in 1968, in Identity, Youth and Crisis, the same Erik Erikson writes that we are dealing, quote, with a process located in the core of the individual and yet also in the core of his communal culture. A process which establishes, in fact, the identity of these two identities. That is the identity of what is at the core of the individual with the core of what is in an individual's culture. If you had said to someone in the 1930s that gender, religion, nationality, sexuality and race were aspects of the same dimension of a person, I think they would have looked at you blankly. They would have had no idea what you were talking about, and they certainly wouldn't have had a name for that aspect. And yet now, if I say that to you, you say, yeah, this is all identity. And so it's familiar now, and it's everywhere. So it's worth developing an account of it. That's what philosophers think. If something is familiar and everywhere, we owe ourselves an account of it. And I think there are three central things to grasp about the conceptual structure of the very idea of identity. The first is a point that is important to philosophers, which is that I think identities come with labels, and that's important to philosophers because that makes me a nominalist about identities. I think that we should understand them in terms of the way the labels work, not in terms of some deep, real feature of things, but in terms of the way we apply labels, and I'll get back to that later. So identifying someone, saying that is what her identity is, begins with giving a name that can apply, at least in principle, to more than one person. But of course, having the label is only the beginning. It's an important beginning, though. In having a label, you have, as I said, a name and criteria for its application. You can divide the world into those who bear the label and those who don't. And then you can discuss with others how you do that. Pretty soon here, disagreements arise. Introduce the label Protestant, and you will start dividing the world into Protestants, no doubt, and Catholics, and the rest, the others. You'll say, perhaps, that a Protestant is one of those who followed Luther out of the Roman Catholic Church. But if you know nothing of the Church's early history and the divisions between the Eastern and Western churches, you may think that every Christian is either Protestant or Roman Catholic. You may not know about the Assyrian Church or the Copts. You may not know that the Moravians, who claim the Protestant label too, separated from Rome before Luther, so they certainly didn't follow Luther out of the church. You may wonder, when you learn about them, whether it's proper to call Mormons, when you learn about what they're like, it's proper to call Mormons Protestant. And in the 19th century, many people did wonder whether the Mormons were properly called Protestant. Indeed, many wondered whether they were properly called Christian, even despite the fact that their name was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Perhaps the people who introduced the label, Protestant, meant to apply it only to people who shared some special property. Accepting the Augsburg Confession in your innermost heart, for example, that might be one way of thinking about what a Protestant is. But most people who call themselves Protestants today have no idea about what it was in the Augsburg, what was in the Augsburg Confession. Most people who identify as Protestants don't know about that. And some of them, I'm sure, many contemporary Protestants do not believe everything in the Augsburg Confession. What they all have in common is that the normal uses of the label agree about, that's all the ways in which people talk about Protestants. There are some seats up front. Have in common is that the normal users agree that there are certain paradigm cases, if you like, of fitting and not fitting under the label. So, evangelical Lutherans, for example, are Protestant. The Pope is not. And if your idea of Protestantism fails these basic tests, it won't be taken seriously. So you have to get something right. The point generalizes. Many identity labels are applied by different people according to different yardsticks. Provided they agree about certain paradigm examples and counterexamples, we can think of them as having, as we might say, different conceptions of the same identity, not as using the word to refer to different identities, or just referring to entirely different things. This fact about how we think about identities means that it doesn't generally make sense to suppose that there is some essential property that gives you your identity. That's one of the reasons why I'm a nominalist about them. What makes someone a Protestant isn't something that the people who use that label all have to agree about. And despite the intensity of their disagreements, there's no reason to suppose that there is a correct answer. And there doesn't need to be a correct answer for the label Protestant to work pretty well as an identity label, even if we can't say, we can't write a definition that's responsive to all the reasonable uses of the term. But settling who's in and who's out, that is simply being able to divide the world into Protestants and non-Protestants, is not enough to have a social identity. You need that connection between the communal and the individual that Erickson talked about, the connection between the we and the I. For a label to generate a social identity, the label must figure in the inner life of some of the people it applies to. They must identify, sometimes doing and feeling things because they are, to stick with our example, Protestants. Sometimes all that's required is just a norm of what you might call solidarity. We Protestants must stick together. So I need to do this thing for some fellow Protestant. Sometimes it's a norm of shared behavior. We Protestants believe in repentance, so I must repent. Or we believe in Lenten fasting, so I must fast. Sometimes it will be not an act, but a sentiment that shows an identification. We Protestants have a worthy tradition of respect for individual rights, so I feel a sense of pride as I'm reminded of the power of the First Amendment. There's one more thing besides labels and this process of identification, which, as I say, shapes thoughts and feelings and acts. There's one thing more that we need, I think, to make an identity social. And that's identities must lead people to treat those who bear the label in particular ways. So it's not just enough that I identify for it to be a social identity. There have to be responses to me that are generated by the ascription of a label to me. So part of what makes Protestant a social identity is that you can get treated as a Protestant both by other Protestants and by people who are not Protestant at all. It has to be possible, that is, not just to identify as a Protestant yourself, but to be identified as one in social life by other people. Just as people don't have to agree about who bears the label, and as I said, in the case of Protestant they don't have to agree about what you should do if you identify with the label, and they don't have to agree about how you should be treated if you bear it. But very often people of a certain identity do mostly share some ideas about how they ought to behave because they're of that identity, because they're Protestants, and that'll make it possible to predict what they'll do. They'll do the things that they think Protestants ought to do. And out of this sort of thing, stereotypes will develop. And one reason that identities are useful is that they can help us predict what people, especially strangers, will do. If I'm a Catholic and I go to Burkina Faso and I want to go to church on Sunday, I know that if I go into a Catholic church, I will recognize the forms of service. They may be going on in some Burkinabe language, but I will know where I am because people will be popping up and down and crossing themselves at exactly the right moments. So they're useful, these stereotypes. And now stereotyping, on the other hand, is often negative and inaccurate, but it can survive both those things because it's also useful sometimes. So that's what I think identities are. They're ways of grouping people, often with contested criteria of membership, that are associated with ideas about what identification means for those people, the ones who have the label, and how they should be treated. And these ideas about identification and treatment will be contested too. And what makes them social is that these ideas are both shared and contested within social groups, people who communicate with one another using the identity labels that I say are at the core of identities. The uses of identity go far beyond their role in sustaining stereotypes and norms of behavior, of course. They also play a central role through what I was calling identification in defining our lives, because we make our lives as men and as women, as straight and as gay, as Ghanaian and as American, as Protestant and as Catholic, and so on through a wide range of social identities. That's possible because, as I stressed a little while ago, identities come with norms, contested, sure, but norms nevertheless about how people of a certain identity should behave. And let's call those norms of identification. People don't only do and avoid doing things because they're, say, Americans. There are things that, as Americans, they think they ought and ought not to do. And the ought here is what a philosopher might call a general practical ought. It's an ordinary ought, it's not some special moral ought. So here are some examples of the sorts of norms I have in mind. Here's a negative norm. Men ought not to wear dresses. Gay men ought not to fall in love with women. Blacks and whites ought not to embarrass their respective races. Muslims ought not to eat pork. Positive ones. Men ought to open doors for women. Gay people ought to come out. Blacks ought to support affirmative action. Muslims ought to make the Hajj. Now, I'm reporting these norms. I'm not endorsing them. I'm just giving you instances of the kinds of norms that I think are associated with identities and kinds of norms that I hope you'll recognize. I myself don't take the view that, for example, that men shouldn't wear dresses, though it's not something I happen to do myself. But you recognize the norm. You see a man in a dress, you're surprised. Now, at least in standard contexts, contexts in which it's not surprising. Now, I want to point out at once that there's a very wide range of kinds of people that fit the general rubric I've laid out beyond the ones that we normally talk of. So, for example, there are professional identities: lawyer, nurse, journalist, philosopher. There are what you might call vocations: artist, composer, novelist. And there are all kinds of formal and informal affiliations: Manchester United fan, blank looks, jazz aficionado, conservative, and so on. And you can continue making lists like these. Now, given these many available identities, it's interesting because for much of human history, for many people, the range of available identities was much smaller than the range of identities available. I'm not saying that identities didn't exist before the 1950s, I'm saying this conception didn't exist. Obviously there were genders and races and nationalities and religions, and they figured in the lives of people before that. But I think that people had fewer options of this sort in the past, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why they've come to assume the role that they have. Now, so given all this range of identities, it's reasonable to ask how large a part each of them should play in, for example, our political lives, whether we take politics in the narrow sense of dealing with the government or the state, or more broadly as our dealings in our social lives with issues of power in relation to one another, in ways that may not involve the state. And to answer these questions, however, I think it's helpful not to begin with politics, and not really with social life directly, but with what I'll call the ethical life of men and women, individuals. So let me explain that idea quickly. Each of us has a life to live. We face many moral demands, but those demands leave many options open. Maybe unless you're a utilitarian. In reality, maybe you may narrow your options down to a very small number, but I'm not a utilitarian. So they leave you many options, I think. So, for example, you mustn't be cruel or dishonest, but you can still live in many ways consistently with avoiding those vices. Of course, all of us have constraints of historical circumstances and physical and mental endowment as well. I was born into the wrong family to be a Yoruba Oba or king, and I have the wrong kind of body for motherhood. I'm too short to be a successful professional basketball player, also too clumsy, and I'm insufficiently musical to be a concert pianist. I had a lot of piano lessons through which I discovered that. But also viola lessons, actually. But even when we have taken these things into account, each human life has many possibilities. Everybody has, or at least should have, a great variety of decisions to make in shaping a modern life. And a philosophical liberal like me thinks that these choices belong in the end to the person whose life it is, that each of us should take these choices for ourselves. I think that means at least two things. First, the standard by which we decide whether I'm doing well, whether I'm leading a good life, whether I'm flourishing, is in part set by aims I define myself. And second, so for example, if I don't have a vocation as a novelist, it doesn't matter whether I write any novels. But if I have a vocation as a novelist, it does. And whether it matters that someone has written novels depends therefore in part on whether they have a vocation as a novelist, which is up to them. So that's the first thought. Second, provided I give others their moral due, the job of managing my life is my own. Thoughtful friends, benevolent sages, anxious relatives will rightly offer advice as to how I should proceed, but it's advice that they reasonably offer. They're not entitled to force me or to pressure me. And just as private coercion would be wrong, it would be wrong when undertaken by governments interested in the perfection of their citizens. So once I've done my duty, the shaping of my life is my responsibility. Respecting this idea means taking the idea of individuality seriously, but our individuality isn't produced in a vacuum. It's shaped by the available social forms, including the identities, and of course by our interactions with others. Chapter 3 of John Stuart Mill's great book on liberty, which is called On Individuality as one of the elements of well-being, is the classic English formulation of this notion of individuality. But as Mill freely acknowledged in that book, his own thinking about these matters had been profoundly shaped by an essay written by Wilhelm von Humboldt, written in the 1790s and known to us in English as The Limits of State Action. I think it's good, that's how we know it, because the German title is Ideen zu einem Versuch, die Grenzen der Wirksamkeit des Staats zu bestimmen. That would be hard to say every time you wanted to mention Wilhelm von Humboldt. So, in chapter 2, which is called Of the Individual Man and the Highest Ends of His Existence, you can see why Mill might have been influenced by this, Humboldt wrote that it is, quote, through a social union based on the individual wants and capacities of its members that each is enabled to participate in the rich collective resources of the others. So the point is that this notion of individuality is highly social. It's not a matter of hiving off and going off and being by yourself. So because you believe in individuality, you do not have to ignore the call of sociability. Indeed, as we've said, the connection between individuality and identity means that who I am will be connected with groups, in part through what I was calling norms of identification. Now, I think identities are so diverse and extensive in the modern world because people need an enormous array of these socially provided tools in making a modern life. And the range of options sufficient for each of us isn't going to be enough for us all. Indeed, people are making up new identities all the time. Gay is basically 4 or 5 decades old as a form of identity. Punk is younger, at least in its modern sense. It has an older sense in African American usage. And as John Stuart Mill said in one of my favorite passages from On Liberty, if it were only that people have diversities of taste, that is reason enough for not attempting to shape them all after one model. But different persons also require different conditions for their spiritual development. Unless there is a corresponding diversity in their modes of life, they neither obtain their fair share of happiness, nor grow up to the mental, moral, and aesthetic statures of which their nature is capable. Okay, so far I've just been taking some familiar facts, I don't suppose anything I've just said strikes you as controversial, and putting them into a philosophical picture of identity. And so far I've mostly stressed the positive work of identity, but now I want to suggest some reasons why social identities generate so much difficulty for our social life today. I think 2 pieces of psychology are especially helpful, relevant here. One is the fact that we're all programmed to be what developmental psychologists call essentialist. For those of you who are philosophy majors, this is not the philosophical use of the term, so forget what you know. Faced with a group of people with some shared visible property, even very young children, 2, 3, 4 years old, are likely to suppose that there's some deep invisible underlying property, an essence, that explains why they belong together. Essentialism, as the developmental psychologist Susan Gilmer puts it, is the view that certain categories, e.g. women, racial groups, dinosaurs, original Picasso artwork, have an underlying reality or true nature that one cannot observe directly. Furthermore, this underlying reality or essence is thought to give objects their identity and to be irresponsible for similarities that category members share. And the evidence she gathered in her wonderful book, The Essential Child, supports the view that all of us are prone to essentialism, beginning at least at the age of 2.5. Now, I've been insisting that identities are the result of labels, and that there are often nothing deep or important that underlies them, since we often don't even agree on who is in or out. But our tendency to essentialism means that once we have a category of persons, we're likely to come to believe that there must be some underlying important property that explains why people are in it. Race provides an obvious example here. Racial categories are based on a mixture of criteria and vary from place to place. The label black or Negro is applied sometimes on the basis only of appearance, sometimes of ancestry, sometimes on other things. Despite the fact that all these ways of doing it produce categorizations that are of no real biological significance, it is almost impossible to persuade people that Negroes have no deep shared common properties that explain why they belong together. Many years ago, the W.E. Du Bois, the leading African-American intellectual of the 20th century, perhaps the leading African-American intellectual ever, put the point precisely in the days when the so-called Jim Crow laws in the American South required blacks and whites to travel in separate spaces in public transportation. And he said, when he was asked for a scientific definition of his race, he said, "The black man is a person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia." And that was a good answer in his context. So that, for example, among the black men, by that criterion, was Walter White, not the one you know from television, but the mid-20th century head of the NAACP, who had blonde hair and blue eyes, but was an African-American, because we have a criterion of descent in this country that makes you African-American if you have African-American ancestors. And he led the NAACP, and when he was in the South, if he identified as an African-American, they put him in the same part of the bus as the people who were not blonde and blue-eyed African-Americans. Of course, he was able to pass, which is why he did some of the most spectacular research on lynching, because he was able to join white people when they were doing that. All right. So why does this matter? Well, if you think a group of people has a deep and important shared property that you don't have, you're likely to wonder if you can get along with them. That's one of the things that happens. You're likely to think of them as capital O other. And that has bad consequences because of a second important deep feature of our social psychologies, which is our tendency to treat people who are other with hostility or contempt, and to band together against them and for us. Now, these tendencies of our nature are profoundly shaped, of course, by the ideas floating around in our culture. Contemporary ideas about race are shaped by circulating ideas about genes, and that concept was invented only a little over a century ago, around about 1900. I know you think Mendel invented genes, but he didn't use that word, and his work was forgotten until the early 20th century, when Morgan, who got the first Nobel Prize in medicine, rediscovered it all using not peas but Drosophila. So the very idea of a distinction between the biological and the non-biological properties of human beings was put in place only a century before that, around 1800. Again, the word Biologie, which comes very quickly into English from German, is coined in 1800, and the word genetics was coined by William Bateson at Cambridge around 1905. But once a category like race is put in play, it can be very hard to escape and very tempting to think that it must have a scientific basis. This is not just the result of conceptual practices. As I've argued, social identities lead people to be treated in certain ways. Even if you wanted to escape an identity, the constant insistence upon it in everyday life by others would make you likely in the end to identify, to feel and therefore act because of your identity, and to feel connected with others who share it and divided from those who do not. An identity does not have to have an essence to have power. After 1492, with the expulsion of non-Christians, Jews and Muslims from Spain, Christian intellectuals, whose ancestors had worked for centuries alongside Muslims and Jews, were unable to escape the thought that even those who converted to the Holy Catholic Church, the conversos, must really remain different underneath. The other day I received an email from an Englishwoman who had heard me talking on the radio. When Sheku Kane Mason won the BBC Young Musician of the Year award, she wrote to me, playing Shostakovich's first cello concerto, it seemed culturally incongruous, and yet I knew that it really wasn't. That was because Sheku's mother came from Sierra Leone and his father from Antigua in the Caribbean. But he grew up in Nottingham in England, and his 5 brothers and sisters are all also accomplished classical musicians. The pull of essentialism is the only reason why anyone would find this surprising. Identities divide the world. In doing so, they draw some us together, dividing that us from some them. The solidarities thus created have built the human world. It's as Americans that we built the United States. As Catholics, that people have built the largest Christian denomination in the world. Gay people have taken a once despised homosexual identity and created a flourishing gay culture. Mothers, sisters, daughters joined together as women to make a movement that has reformed gender identities everywhere. So much for the solidarities. But the divisions have created wars among nations, ethno-racial conflict in every continent, and the persecution of minorities in every society, even in Sweden. There's one more piece of the social psychology that I'd like to remind you of in closing. Long ago, in the history of social psychology, Gordon Allport argued for what he called the contact hypothesis. Roughly, it says that contact between individuals of different groups makes hostility and prejudice less likely if it occurs in a framework that meets a few important social conditions. Crucially, it must be on terms of equality, or rough equality, and it must be in an activity that, where shared goals are pursued in the context of mutual dependency. So that's one reason why the racially integrated American military produces people who are less racist on average when they leave than when they arrive in the armed forces. And there's good evidence for that. It doesn't mean they're not racist when they leave, it just means they're less racist. It's one reason, I suspect, why straight soldiers who have worked together with gay comrades in Holland or Israel or Britain are less homophobic than many American soldiers who have only recently had to come to deal with having queer comrades. It's why white football and basketball players tend to be more relaxed around black people and more engaged with racial justice than some of their peers, some of the people that they went to high school with who didn't go into those activities. So if we're to manage the tendency towards violent division, it will help if we allow our children to grow up sharing the public world with people of many identities, engaging with them on terms of rough equality in activities which are significant, where they depend upon one another, learning and building together in productive contact. And to do that, I think it may help to have one other label to live by. We live with 7 billion fellow humans on a small, rapidly warming planet. Cosmopolitan impulse that draws on our common humanity is no longer a luxury. I think it's become a necessity. And in encapsulating that creed, I want to draw on the words of a slave from Roman Africa, a Latin interpreter of Greek comedies, a writer from classical Europe who called himself Terence the African, Publius Terentius Afer. So I don't think I can make the point better than he did, writing more than 2 millennia ago, when he said, Homo sum humani nihil a me alienum puto. I am human, I think nothing human, alien to me. That sentence expresses the essence of the cosmopolitan vision that sees our humanity, the label human, as one we need to place beside and sometimes above all the others. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Professor Appiah. I was wondering if I could just open our questions by asking you that we have governments today which talk about that we should restrict immigration, we should restrict people from coming into our country, into our borders, because we need to protect our national character, our national identity. Who do you think they're protecting it for? And for people much like me and much like you, I think as well, who want to see more of this, who want to see people be open to other people and let especially the most needy in. How do we change their mind on that? Or should we?
So, I think we don't need to abandon the thought that it's okay to have national borders and immigration laws that are not completely open to absolutely anybody who chooses to come. I think that's, people disagree about that, but my view is that that can be done in a way that's morally acceptable. But there are many constraints on, there are many normative constraints on immigration law, constraints that every country ought to respect. Some of those are set by important moral ideas that are embodied in international law, like the law of asylum. It's just wrong to send somebody back to persecution and death if they arrive at your borders, and you have a moral and international law or a legal obligation not to do that. I happen to think that the way the laws of asylum are currently constructed internationally is not ideal, because the classic international law of asylum assigns responsibility for asylees to the first place they show up. And the first place they show up is often a very poor country. And I think there should be a system for sharing in a cosmopolitan way, in a global way, the burdens of dealing with the needs of asylees more rationally than simply by the fact that they happen to show up somewhere. But it's agreed that if they show up on your borders, it's morally impermissible to send them back to suffering and death. I mean, it's agreed in theory. There are lots of states that are violating this agreement, including us. And similarly, I don't think it's okay for immigration law to be sexist, racist, to display all the vices that one ought not to display in the construction of laws, and so on. On the other hand, so if people say they want to preserve something about a nation, and provided that the way they want to preserve it is consistent with these ideas, I think it should be a matter of democratic politics whether they get to do so. In that democratic politics, you have to look at I think at the traditions of the society. You can't, here in democratic politics we draw on national, local traditions, as it were. In the United States, it seems to me beyond preposterous, given our traditions and given how the country was constituted, not to recognize the importance of continuing to allow migrants to come, who are not asylees, who are not refugees, but people who just like to be here. But it's also reasonable to make requirements of people who come in, that you're entering a democracy, so we want you to understand democratic institutions, our democratic institutions, our particular traditions. And also, I think we want you to allow us to teach your children, at least, if not you, the language of American politics, which happens to be English. That is perfectly consistent, of course, with recognizing that you can speak two languages, which seems to be a fact lost on many contemporary Americans. So that requiring someone to learn English is not requiring them to stop speaking Arabic or Tree or Hungarian or Spanish or whatever it is. That's a very different thing, and I think that's unreasonable for lots of reasons, to do with the role of language in the expression of forms of identity that people are entitled to hold on to when they cross national borders. So, who are they doing it for? I think the main reason why these forms of ethno-nationalism turn xenophobic is because of our psychology. It's a very easy way for political leaders to generate support, ethnic chauvinism is a very easy way to generate support. And in circumstances where they are incompetent in other ways, for example, or where it's hard for them to do more useful things for people, that's one temptation that politicians succumb to, and this is a perfectly global phenomenon. A responsible political class won't do it. It won't allow this to happen because it produces a downward spiral. In arguing against doing it, in the United States in particular, we can, I think, show that there's vast amounts of evidence for the proposition that our economy is stronger, our society is stronger, our role in the world is more effective if we don't turn inwards and stop inviting people to come and join us, or permitting people to come and join us. But while, given the way the us-them psychology works, as I say, it's very tempting for politicians, I think, to appeal to this, especially in circumstances of where people are feeling under pressure. And the pressure doesn't have to be economic. When it is economic, you can get very extreme reactions. One of the important facts about Rwanda, for example, is that it's one of the most densely populated countries in the world. There's a huge ecological pressure for population, so it's a very, there's a lot of economic stress and a lot of social stress generated by their ecological situation. Obviously, when in the Balkans the former Yugoslav government collapsed, people who had a kind of sense of themselves as belonging in a settled economy where they could send their children to school and hope that they would go into professions and so on, and all that collapsed. Political leaders fell back on ethnic and religious categories in order to contest a rapidly diminishing cake, to fight over smaller and smaller portions of a cake that was getting smaller all the time. And in those circumstances, it takes very powerfully responsible political leadership to stop people appealing to those ethno-nationalist things. But as I say, it doesn't have to be that, because the pressure that produces some forms of American chauvinism today is not really economic, though. I mean, it's not everywhere economic. It's to do with a sense, I think. That is to say, it's not extreme poverty or the loss of the possibility of food and support, which was true in the Balkans or in Rwanda. It's more like a sense that we had this idea about what we were all doing here, and it involved things getting better for our children and so on. And that deal seems to have broken. And then the political leaders come in and blame foreign workers, whether they've come in or they're working somewhere else, for all this. That's a misdiagnosis. The anxiety is real, and something needs to be done about it, but I think it's the wrong thing to do.
I'm interested by the idea of this American chauvinism that you mentioned, and I think you were quoted in an article in The Guardian saying that mistaken ideas of identity translate to big decisions in foreign policy. I think one of the specific instances that you talked about then was the Iraq War, and how mistaken conceptions of identity at the policy-making level in terms of how we determine cultures and how that translates to understanding of countries. I was wondering if you could just expand a bit more on that.
Well, so, I mean, this is one of those things where I think a kind of essentialism comes in. So when something happens in the domain of international relations, the first thing we do is sort of categorize people as something, Europeans or Scots, I mean, different levels, Catalans. I mean, there are lots of different levels here. And after 9/11, a category that became salient in that way and essentialized was Muslim. And so people started connecting things that had almost nothing to do with one another because they thought of them all as flowing from some Muslim essence, roughly. And I think so that's an example, I think, where careful reflection on what is and isn't entailed by, for example, religious identities is a really important part of thinking sensibly about how to operate both in domestic and in international politics. we do this, I mean, we do this with most religious entities, even the ones that we're not hostile to. Catholics are way more diverse, I think, than most people, including most Catholics, normally think. I was raised in the Episcopal Church. I was an Anglican. Anglicans are a pretty diverse bunch too. So the idea that there's something that's at the core of being an Anglican, which is a tiny sect, or a Christian, which is several billion people, I think is a mistake. But it does lead people to have stereotyped expectations of people when they're given these labels. So I think it's important and helpful for intellectuals to remind the policy people, who are a different kind of intellectual, but they're also intellectuals, that they're making mistakes when they use those categories in that way. And so the last chapter of the book I just finished is about why I think Western is a very, very unhelpful category for thinking about anything, politics, culture, and I would say identity.
Earlier in your speech, you mentioned the idea of, in your pianist days and playing violin, and the choice in finding your own identity as well. And I'm sure that also translates to the choice of different ways to understand or appreciate our identities as well. And something we always hear, especially on campus, especially in this generation, is the ideas of cultural appropriation and cultural imperialism on the other side of the spectrum. I was wondering what you believe that one's stance towards such things should be.
Consider Basho, a great Japanese poet, perhaps the greatest haiku writer. He couldn't have been who he was, and I'm picking a Japanese because that's a culture we think of as incredibly closed off and internally, homogeneous and all that. He couldn't have been Basho if he hadn't been a Zen Buddhist. And he couldn't have been a Zen Buddhist if the Buddha, who, as you probably know as well as anyone, was born in India, had not had ideas that percolated through China into Japan. Without that story, Basho is not Basho. So, as I say, I picked Japan because everybody thinks it's this wonderful closed box, which it isn't. There are no closed boxes. But if you think about the writers we most admire in Europe, Shakespeare, there's no Shakespeare without Petrarch, without Tacitus. Many of his main stories are about Timon of Athens, Julius Caesar, who's a Roman, Hamlet, who's a Dane, who would have called himself Umlet, and so on. So the idea that the things we care about in culture could survive if we policed the identity boundaries, if we said men can only write about things done by men of their own culture and identity, women can only write about things done by women of their own race and class, and so on. If we tried to do that, I would shoot myself. There'd be almost nothing worthwhile left in the domain of culture, and that's strikingly true in music, which is this field in which these accusations of cultural appropriation have been made a great deal recently. The rhythmic dance patterns in some of Monteverdi's music come from Arab music, and some, I don't know much about this, but I'm told that some come from Andean music, which was beginning to be heard in Europe at the time. Again, is Monteverdi better if he says, "Whoops, I mustn't use that, it's Arab"? So I'm not sympathetic to the basic theoretical idea of cultural appropriation. However, in many contexts, what people are talking about when they criticize something as cultural appropriation is something else. It's the exploitation of people, and exploitation is wrong. Taking advantage of people's vulnerabilities is wrong. And if you do so in the context of making art, it's wrong, just as it would be in the context of doing anything else. So, and similarly, some appropriation is insensitive or insulting. If I take if I take the Kaddish and use it to take copies of the Kaddish and use it as toilet paper, even if that's an artwork, I'm clearly doing something that involves a kind of insensitivity to the role of it as in Jewish acts of mourning. So I don't have sympathy with the theory behind critiques of cultural appropriation for the reason I gave. But I know that sometimes when people are criticizing culture, what they're criticizing is something that I also think is wrong, but not for that reason, for some other kind of reason. So I don't think one wants simply to assume that that, as it were, you can take anything you like under any circumstances whatsoever. There are reasons why we have notions of respect that are relevant to the creation of art. We have notions of, we also have notions of intellectual property, which may or may not be helpful, but are nevertheless there and need to be respected. So if Paul Simon didn't pay enough to the Mbakanga musicians who helped him make Graceland, that's wrong. But that doesn't mean there's something wrong with Graceland. It's a fine, in my view, a very fine and enjoyable piece of popular music, and nothing wrong with it. With the music, there may, as I say, have been behind the production of the music. There may have been bad behaviour. Indeed, behind the production of most popular music, there seems to be a lot of bad behaviour. Not all of it having to do with identity. So I don't have sympathy with critique of the idea of cultural appropriation. I think culture is appropriation. All the things that we care about most have sort of travel and borrow. And that's an important fact about them. Many Japanese netsuke are made from ivory. There's no Japanese elephants. So, no borrowing, no netsuke. So I think it's a bad theory, but it doesn't mean that there aren't equally bad practices that are being condemned in the name of this bad theory, and we should just get the correct theory of what's wrong with them. And that will also distinguish between the cases where we should be condemnatory and the cases where I think we should just celebrate that someone has found a way to take something from one place to another and put it to good use.
And right before we move on to the audience, just final question from me. I know in philosophy 101 classes that I took, we always talk about the idea of the philosopher king, and we had to put you in that situation. How I don't know if that's the ideal of all philosophers, but how would you suggest that governments and policymakers, back to the idea of identity politics, that we accommodate for all these identities yet still nurture the next generation of students and children to still be patriotic and still be patriots, who have some sort of identity that brings them apart, that brings them together with the rest of their country, rest of their people.
Yes.
How do we encourage that in terms of, from a state, national centric view?
Well, I think that, again, that's one of those places where the answer has to be something of a local answer. So in our constitutional tradition, there's the possibility of a kind of constitutional patriotism that focuses not on the words on a piece of paper, but on the traditions of law and politics that have been generated by them. In taking those seriously, we have to take seriously the fact that they're radically imperfect, our constitutional traditions. They began not just with the exclusion of blacks and women from political participation, but with the exclusion of most unpropertied men. So it was, and they called it democracy. So I don't know what they were thinking. It took a very long time to begin to do the right things about those things. Women didn't get the vote until the 20th century. Real political participation for black people in much of this country didn't occur until the 1960s, and so on. So you can identify with constitutional patriotism as Frederick Douglass did or Martin Luther King did, while being a critical appreciator of it, while saying that we haven't lived up to it, that we can do better. But so in this kind of context, I think that in other places, in Pakistan is constitutionally a Muslim country. So Islam has to figure in the story. Pakistan ought, because it has this obligation under international law and under morality, not to abuse its non-Sunni Muslim citizens. It ought not to do as it does, unfortunately. It ought not, for example, with the Ahmadiyya, whom it treats very badly, worse than Christians, whom it treats on the whole not too badly. So I think you have to tell a different story. You have to make a story that works for the place that you are. It has to be, I believe, consistent, roughly consistent with the truth. It doesn't have to be absolutely consistent with the truth, because constitutional myth-making is part of what holds nations together. But I think a story that's too remote from reality just isn't going to work to bind people together. Renan, the great 19th century French intellectual historian, intellectual comma historian, and patriot, and also conservative, said that scientific history, the study of history, is often the enemy of the nation, because he was aware that another thing he said was that nations are made as much by what they choose to forget as by what they remember. And historians don't like to forget things, so they're constantly trying to drag up things that you've been trying to forget. But so you have to be careful to make a story that I think is sustainable, and because you're going to tell it to your children, and you don't want to lie to your children. You can simplify it for your children, but you mustn't lie to them. So I think we have to tell different stories in different places. But one of the things I think that can help us avoid a kind of chauvinistic nationalism is the recognition of the thing that I said at the start, which is that we have many identities. And while national identities do link people together and are needed in order to generate the political energy that's needed for states to act, people in the state to act together, which is a hard thing to do. It's hard to get 330 million people that are mobilized. And so you need the national identifications to do that. I don't mean that's very important. But you don't need that for everything, and in many contexts it's not at all helpful. When you're thinking about other things, when you think about literature, for example, I don't think national chauvinism is terribly helpful, again, for reasons I just explained. So I think we can construct usable, democratic national identities that are respectful of the broad outlines of the truth of the history of the nation, and build on them. And that means that it depends what history of the nation is, what story you have to tell.
Thank you. We'll move on to some audience questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand. If you could just say your name before you ask it, and I'll just pick one. Gentleman over there.
Hi, I'm Shrey. It's great listening to your talk. You mentioned that the ought for identity is certainly not as obligatory as a sort of ethical, moral, higher ought. Now, but it's also clear that there is some sort of strength to that ought. If you could elaborate on what, because I mean, there's one case where somebody says you're only an Athenian if you're a good person, but that's a little trivial. Where, to what extent do you think that ought exists? I mean, I'm sure it's hard to quantify. It's not really half an ethical ought, but how far?
Well, there's two different kinds of questions. I mean, one is there's a sort of historical question. How do norms get built into identities through time? That's one question. And then your question is really a question about what authority do these norms have for us? And your initial point was just that they don't have usually the authority of a moral norm. They don't have the, so when I said that there's a norm of identification around gender in the United States that means that men on the whole don't think they should wear dresses, that used to be thought of as a moral norm, and in fact it was a legal norm. People got arrested if they men got arrested if they put on dresses. Less common to arrest women for putting on male clothing, but that happened too sometimes. The norms I was talking about are just norms that I'm recognizing as a social fact. I'm saying it's a social fact that we run these things. Whether they have authority for you is going to depend on things like whether you identify, whether you think of yourself as a creature of a certain identity, and which of the norms associated with that identity you, for one reason or another, take seriously. There are almost no norms of identification associated with, say, gender that aren't contested by somebody. You can mention any norm you like, and I can suggest to you that there may be people who reject it, while still claiming a gender identity, right? And those people often want us to shift our notions, so that the rest of us come to see the norms that they respect as norms that everybody should respect, right? That's one of the things that goes on in what's sometimes called, it's one of the things people mean by identity politics, is discussions among both bearers of the label and people who don't bear the label of what being a person of that kind does entail, right? Discussions is too gentle a word, often violent arguments about that. You know, you will feel the pull of some of these norms, even if you can see that they're not moral norms, and so they're not, they don't have the obligatory, they don't have the power, the normative power of moral norms. But you can still feel the pull of them. And part of the sociology of identity is trying to understand how norms develop around identities and how they get that pull on the psychology of their bearers. But yes, I don't think of them as the norms, as I mentioned at the time, the norms I mentioned, but not ones that I myself I'm inclined. Well, I guess I do think Muslims should make the Hajj if they can, because that's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. but the others, I think, you know, if you want to contest them, you'll be pushing an open door with me. But I'd be perfectly happy to stick with some of them, and others I'm actually actively against. I'm actively against norms about, gender norms about opening doors, because I decided at a certain point that they expressed a condescending view of women, the ones that I was raised with. So I stopped doing it.
Are there any other questions? Yes, jump over there.
Hi, my name's Andy. Thank you for your talk. I really appreciated that you showcased kind of a path forward on how to deal with the problem of essentializing people in other groups. You said, you know, you try to, for yourself or other people in places where they're in an equal situation and they're dependent on each other. When it comes to policing members of your own group, or thinking about the idea that within a particular identity there might be debates happening, how do you, as a member of that group, how do you approach that kind of issue of policing and accepting difference within your own group? Are there some tricks to do that?
Well, you know, because of because not moral norms, for example, are I believe, strongly binding. One lever you have in intra-group debates about the meaning of a certain identity is arguments that the way it's currently configured are immoral. That for example, caste identities, which shape notions of Hinduness and so on, are involve forms of treatment of people that are morally unacceptable. So there, you can say it's not as it were just a matter of taste whether one does it one way or another. There's something wrong with doing it a certain way. I mean, where I grew up, people treated servants in a way that I think is quite unacceptable, morally speaking, and some of that was to do with thinking of them as belonging to social groups that weren't entitled to respect. So sometimes your arguments are going to be based on reasons, moral reasons. Sometimes they'll be based in prudence, right? You know, if we, I don't know, if our sect continues to insist that everybody, that you know, gay people should be executed, it may not be, people may come around to the view that maybe that's how we should be treated in some places. And maybe we should think about whether it's such a good idea to be identified with hostility to some other group in the world or in our society. So there are reasons of prudence for suggesting that ways of thinking associated with identity are a bad idea. But then I think beyond that, I think I'm inclined to be relaxed. That is to say, you know, this as long as we shape our identity in a way that permits satisfactory lives for most of us who bear it, we don't have to settle anything more than that, as it were. You know, because these are things where there isn't a correct answer. There are different ways of configuring, say, an ethnic identity, different possible ways, different historically possible ways, and you have to develop one of them. You have to develop it in company with other members of the group, and probably with people outside the group as well. So you can't just declare that a meaning for your identity. Meaning is social, it has to be generated through collective activity. But beyond that, so take take the recent shifts in our thinking about trans identity. I think the best way to understand what's being asked of us of cis people, by trans people, is to reconfigure our understandings of gender to leave space for them. They're not asking us to abandon the central understandings that we have of our own cis identities. They're just asking us to accommodate them in the system, not to see them as violating norms of gender identity, but as expressing a form of gender identity. And different societies have responded at different speeds to this sort of request or demand. But there's a lot of such, the Indian Supreme Court has said that you have a right to your own gender expression. So you have a constitutional right in India now, if you're trans, to be recognized as trans, or if you reject gender, if you don't want to have a gender identity, you have a constitutional right to refuse a gender identity and so on. And that can happen while most people who identify as women and most people who identify as men go on doing pretty much what they were doing before as men and as women. So it doesn't cost cis people a huge amount. But if it did cost us, or when it does cost us, we have to decide whether, and that means trans and cis people have to talk to each other about this. Neither side can decide as it were on its own. We have to do it together. You know, whether it's a cost we're willing to pay, a demand we're willing to meet. And, you know, I think mostly demands that have been made are quite reasonable. So, but I know some people don't. So we need to have continuing conversation.
Other questions? Yes. Yes.
Hi. My name is Federico, and I would like to know if you would consider wealth, income, and social class as forms of identity, because to me it seems that the influence these things can have in one's life is very similar. But especially when thinking of identity politics, it seems to be something at the same time very distinct.
That's a great question. I mean, so there are 3 or 4 dimensions, I think, that go into shaping class. One is money, wealth, that's true. But there are other kinds of, let's say, capital that are important too. So cultural capital, I think, is extremely important in the shaping of class identities. And so is what sociologists and economists call social capital, which is, roughly speaking, your capacity to mobilize social networks, your connections, and so on. So we've got, at the very least, the kind of cultural capital that you have, because you're a university person, which people who don't go to university don't have some of the cultural capital that people who go to university do. We have money and wealth, and we have social capital. And these are all important dimensions of what we call class. And I haven't looked at the data for the United States, but I recently read a book about Britain, so I'll use that as my example. In Britain now, there is a small group at the top, 15–20%, that has large amounts of financial, social, and cultural capital, all three. And there's a 15% group at the bottom, the precariat, as they call them now, who have low amounts of all three. They don't have much cultural capital. In England, if you're in the precariat, if you're a child of two parents in the precariat, you have a 2% chance of going to university. 2 or 3% chance going to university. And you don't, and if you were asked if you know lots of people, it'll turn out that you mostly just know other people in the precariat. You don't know people outside the precariat, so you have small amounts of social capital. So, but in between, there are people who have, there are some people who have a lot of financial capital but very little capital. You know, there are traders on the stock market who are ignorant fellows and don't know very much and don't purport to have any, don't have the recognition that comes from cultural capital, but they have lots of money. And there are some and there used to be more highly connected people who didn't have much cultural capital. People who were very socially, very branchés, as the French say, but who didn't have, so these all matter, and in particular societies, the configuration of wealth and cultural and social capital that produces self-conscious classes differs. But, and it's a very, I mean, people always say about the United States, well, everybody in America thinks they're middle class. If you ask them, only 42% of Americans say they're middle class. 10%, under 10%, but more than 5%, say they're upper class. Did you know there were any upper class Americans? They think they're there, lots of them. And that's a lot of people. That's 30 million people or something. I think they're upper class. And a lot of people identify as working class in America, and a lot of other people identify as lower class, and they think those are different things. Now, in other words, if you want to understand the real sociology of class in the United States, you have to understand the self-conscious sense of people's identities in relation to these issues of culture and money and connections. And it turns out that it's quite an interesting and complex story. But yes, in that story, there are real identities, that is, things that meet all my criteria for being an identity. They involve labels. Many of them, redneck is a class label. Some people are willing to take it up, perhaps in a jocular way, and accept it, but usually it's used, obviously, as a term of derogation, and so on. So we do have class language, despite what people say about the United States, but it's very complexly connected with wealth and cultural and social capital. And so describing the landscape of class in the United States is difficult. But I think it's obvious that it's there, because I think it's quite, and I should say, like everything in America, it's inflected by both race and gender. Class identities are inflected by race and by gender in lots of ways. So the story is complicated. But yes, it's an important part. The penultimate chapter of my book is about class in America. So I agree with you that it's an important form of identity that we need to think about.
think we have time for one last question, if there is one. Yes.
You said Western is increasingly not productive. What alternatives? Is it, first of all, I mean, is it to be replaced or just a variety of other things?
So, again, this current usage of Western civilization, for example, is surprisingly new. It took off after the First World War in order to, I think, to reunite Europe, essentially, after a very vicious, bloody conflict. And then after the Second World War, it was used in Europe on this side of the Iron Curtain and in North America to create the notion of a shared body of traditions that could be used to counterweigh the Soviet world and the world of the Eastern Bloc. Neither of those ways, and I should say, I think it begins, if you want to sort of trace it all back, I think we can see the beginnings of it in the late first millennium, when in the struggles between Charlemagne's father and grandfather, the Franks, the kingdom of the Franks, against Al-Andalus, the Muslim Spain, where for the first time the idea that Europe is a thing, a cultural thing, not just a geographical thing. So the move from Europe as a name of a space to European as an identity occurs, I think, there, and that's one of the origins of this. So that the divide between Dar el-Islam, the world of Muslim people, and Christendom is built into the early history, or the prehistory, if you like, of this notion of the West. Now, I think all of these moments of differentiation are unhelpful for thinking about the world today, so that's why I say I don't think it's a very helpful identity. I think what replaces it depends on what you're talking about. I don't think it's very helpful to think of Western civilization in the cultural sphere, because I think that stops you. Because if you think that that's if you think of that as something that's rooted in Europe, then you won't understand how Mediterranean the culture was that we look back to. You won't understand how much Egypt and Asia Minor, Persia and what's now Turkey, played in the shaping of the cultural world of the people we look back to. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and also the dramatists and the poets. So I think in a way what's needed is not so much a new language as new knowledge, a recognition of the complexity of the story and of the continual interpenetration of European cultures by the cultures of the Mediterranean, south and eastern sides of the Mediterranean, and I would say the continuing importance from very far back of influences from down the Silk Road, so all the way, connecting all the way to China. And you know, we've configured our scholarship in such a way that most of the scholars who work on these things don't know the languages you need to know in order to see this in the right way. But to see it in the right way, you need to know some of the Turkic languages, you need to know, and the people who know Greek and Latin well tend not to know the Turkic languages, they tend not to know Arabic very well, they tend not to know Giz and the languages of Northeast Africa, they tend not to know how to read Coptic and so on. And I'm not saying I can do any of these things, but I think what that suggests is that we need to develop pictures of sort of cultural transmission and so on, collectively. We need to do work as a community of scholars, not as individual scholars, working together to try to figure out how these very complicated stories. But one of the other sources, I think, of our notion of the West are some ideas within European intellectual life that do go back a long way. So the idea of the translatio studii, the idea that learning went from Athens to Rome, right? That's a very old idea. It's at least well developed by the 11th and 12th centuries in places like France and Germany. So, so I don't mean that there aren't sort of long, interesting, intricate histories to explore, but the idea that you can summarize all that by saying, well, there's this thing called Western civilization, and it went from Athens to to New York by way of Rome and Paris and London, Avignon, Venice, and Florence. I mean, I just think that's. I'm caricaturing a bit, but not too much. A story that seems to me just bad and unhelpful. So the main objection to it, I think, is that it leads people to say things that aren't true about these things. It leads people to ignore the importance of borrowing across these boundaries to the things we care about, right? The things that we call Western civilization, the paintings and the plays and the poems and the novels, are much more. They have been borrowing all along. And there's a nice example. When the Brothers Grimm started collecting German folktales in order to express the German national spirit, they went to this little old lady, I forget where she was, somewhere in southern Germany, and they wrote, and she was their main source. Okay, so now we have all these stories. Well, if you do folklore studies, it turns out that, for example, some of the stories in there have Sanskrit sources. Some of them are well known in France before anybody in Germany ever told them. Some of them are connected with the collections that produce things like the Arabian Nights and so on, the Arab narrative traditions. So they're not expressions of the German Volksgeist. They're not expressions of something distinctively and uniquely German at all, which is what Brothers Grimm thought. So, just that's a simple example, but it makes the point that if you were to throw something out of German culture or European culture on the grounds that you could trace its sources outside Europe, you wouldn't have very much left. So I think it's a bad idea, because I like the Grimm's fairy tales, and I want to be allowed to read them to my nephews and my great-nephews and nieces, and I don't want to have to think about them in the way that the Brothers Grimm did think about them in order to enjoy them.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, if you could thank me. We will be back on the 24th of April debating the Second Amendment repeal, and if Mary could just indulge you for a quick second on the next edition of the review.